Long before the Úlfhéðnar entered battle, before they wore wolf hides or stood at the front of kings' armies, the wolf already ruled the Norse imagination. Not as a pet, not as a symbol of loyalty, but as a force of hunger, violence, and inevitability. In the Norse world, wolves were never neutral. They were omens. They followed battlefields. They waited beyond the firelight. They consumed the dead. To live near wolves was to understand that nature did not negotiate. It took what it wanted. This mattered deeply to a society built on warfare. Norse culture did not separate religion from combat. The gods were not distant judges. They walked beside warriors, whispered in dreams, and demanded payment in blood. And among all the gods, one stood closest to wolves. Odin. Not the wise old man of later romantic retellings, but a god of execution, frenzy, and knowledge bought through pain. Odin did not promise safety. He promised power, at a cost. He ruled Valhalla, but he also ruled the wild. His companions were not gentle creatures. Two wolves, Geri and Freki, sat at his side. Odin fed them his own meat while he drank wine. It was a deliberate image, the god of kings sustained by beasts of hunger. To follow Odin was to accept that violence was sacred. This is where the Úlfhéðnar begin, not on a battlefield, but in belief. The word itself tells a story. Úlfhéðnar means wolf coats or wolf hides. It does not mean men who admired wolves. It means men who wore them, who took the animal's skin as a second identity. In the Norse world, to wear a skin was not symbolic cosplay, it was transformation. Shamans did this. Outlaws did this. Warriors seeking something beyond human limits did this. The wolf was not chosen at random. Unlike bears, which represent raw strength and solitary dominance, wolves hunt in packs. They test, they harass, they break morale before they break bodies. A wolf does not charge blindly. It waits until the moment is right, and then it tears the throat. That predatory patience defined the Úlfhéðnar. They were not line infantry. They were not defenders. They were weapons released at the breaking point. But to become one required more than courage. Norse sources describe a process of shedding the human self. Later writers would romanticize it. But beneath the myth lies something darker and more deliberate. Initiation meant isolation, hunger, exposure, pain, the stripping away of social identity. Family ties weakened. Normal fear was taught to dissolve. The goal was not madness, it was controlled fury. The Norse called this state berserkers, a battle trance where pain dulled, fear receded, and action became instinct. While berserkers are more famous, often depicted wearing bearskins, the Úlfhéðnar were considered something else entirely. Where berserkers embodied explosive rage, wolf warriors embodied relentless pursuit. Cold fury, not blind frenzy. This distinction mattered on the battlefield. Poems like the Haraldskvæði described them as men whom iron could not bite. Not because they were immortal, but because they did not fight like ordinary men. They closed distance without hesitation. They ignored wounds that would stop others. They did not retreat when momentum shifted. To face them was to face something that did not react as expected. Fear spreads fastest when the enemy does not behave like a human. Kings understood this. Harald Fairhair did. At the Battle of Hafrsfjord in 872 CE, when Norway's future was still undecided, Harald used Úlfhéðnar as shock troops. They did not form ranks. They were unleashed. Their role was not to hold ground, but to break it, to tear holes in enemy formations so regular warriors could flood through. They were not many. They were not meant to be. Elite forces never are, but their presence mattered more than their numbers. Because once unleashed, they signaled something irreversible. The battle had entered its final phase. Later, sagas remembered them with unease. Even when praised, they were described as dangerous to stand near. These were men who had stepped too far from ordinary humanity and might not return cleanly. Some accounts suggest that Úlfhéðnar were kept apart from camp before battle, lest their fury ignite too early. That detail matters. It suggests discipline, not chaos. It suggests that these warriors were not uncontrolled beasts, but specialists, dangerous even to allies if mishandled. And this raises an uncomfortable question. If the Úlfhéðnar were so effective, why did they disappear? Why do they remain at the edges of history, half myth, half memory, while other warrior classes became institutions? The answer lies not on the battlefield, but in what happens after the fighting ends. And that is where the story turns darker. The Norse did not confuse the wolf and the bear. Later generations did. Modern retellings often blend all trance fighters into one image. Wild men screaming, immune to pain, driven by madness. But the sources themselves draw lines, clear ones. And those lines matter if we want to understand why the Úlfhéðnar were feared even among warriors. The berserker wore bear skins. The Úlfhéðin wore the wolf. That difference is not cosmetic. It reflects two entirely different ideas of violence. The bear represents solitary dominance, strength without negotiation. When a bear attacks, it overwhelms, it smashes. It ends the encounter quickly. Berserkers embodied this concept. They surged forward in explosive rage, terrifying to face, terrifying to control. Ancient sources describe them biting shields, howling, foaming at the mouth. Whether exaggerated or not, the image is consistent. Uncontrolled power. Kings used berserkers carefully. Some banned them outright. Because once unleashed, they were as dangerous behind the lines as ahead of them. The wolf was something else. The wolf does not explode. The wolf endures. It stalks, it waits, it tests, it attacks when retreat is no longer possible. Wolves do not seek individual glory. They break cohesion. They isolate. They turn order into panic. That is why the Úlfhéðnar were not described as frothing madmen. They were described as cold. The sagas do not emphasize noise. They emphasize movement, speed, precision. Men who advanced without hesitation, who did not flinch when wounded, who did not slow when surrounded. Not because they felt nothing, but because they had trained themselves to function beyond fear. This is where the idea of shucking the human soul enters Norse storytelling. To become a wolf warrior was to step outside normal social identity. These men were not husbands or farmers in battle. They were not citizens. They were something closer to ritual instruments. Tools of Odin's will, not participants in everyday morality. Initiation mattered because the transformation was meant to be permanent, at least during war. Later sagas hint at rituals that involved isolation in forests, fasting, exposure to cold and symbolic death. A man entered the wild as himself and returned changed. Whether these accounts are literal or mythologized, they reflect a psychological truth. The Úlfhéðnar were expected to abandon hesitation. That abandonment was dangerous. A warrior who does not fear death also does not fear consequences. This made Úlfhéðnar perfect for shock warfare and deeply unsettling for kings trying to rule in peacetime. Because what happens when the war ends? The berserkers' fury burned hot and brief. Many burned out. They died young. They were killed by allies or outlawed by law codes in Christianized Scandinavia. The wolf warrior endured longer. Too long. Sagas like Vatnsdæla and Grettis saga describe figures who resemble Úlfhéðnar not as noble heroes, but as dangerous presences, men difficult to live beside, prone to violence even outside war. They are not villains, but they are not safe. This is not accidental. A man trained to live in a predator's mindset does not easily return to plow fields and family disputes. The instincts that keep him alive in battle make him volatile in peace. Suspicion, readiness, aggression without warning. Kings noticed. As Scandinavia centralized, as monarchs like Harald Fairhair tried to unify territories rather than raid them, warriors like the Úlfhéðnar became liabilities. They were loyal to Odin, to battle, to the moment of release. But loyalty to a throne requires restraint. Christianization accelerated the shift. The wolf had no place in a religion that framed order as divine. Odin faded. Christ replaced him. Frenzy became sin. Trance became possession. Men who once served as holy weapons became threats to moral control. So the Úlfhéðnar slipped into myth, not erased, but pushed to the edges, remembered in poetry, half feared, half admired, spoken of as something that belonged to an older, harsher world. But they did not vanish overnight. Traces remain in language, in outlaw legends, stories of men who lived on the margins and fought like animals when pressed. The wolf coat became metaphor, transformation internal rather than visible. And this raises a final, unsettling question. Were the Úlfhéðnar ever meant to survive peace? Or were they always designed as disposable, burned away in war, so society could function afterward? Because if they had fully integrated, the Norse world might never have stabilized at all. The Norse did not believe battle fury was imagined. They believed it was entered. The state they called berserkers was not described as emotion, but as transition. A crossing from ordinary awareness into something narrower, colder, and more dangerous. Later, Christian writers would dismiss it as madness or demonic possession, but the pagan sources treat it with grim respect. This was not chaos, it was a tool. And like any tool, it had to be learned. The sagas never give us a clean manual. They were not written to teach technique. But when accounts are read side by side, poems, law codes, fragments of myth, a pattern emerges. The trance was not accidental. It was cultivated. Initiation into the wolf warrior path was meant to strip away hesitation. Hunger weakened the body and sharpened focus. Cold broke comfort. Isolation erased social feedback. Without voices to moderate behavior, the initiate confronted fear directly, until fear lost its power to command action. This was not unique to the Norse. Similar practices appear in steppe cultures, warrior cults, and shamanic traditions worldwide. What makes the Úlfhéðnar distinct is how deliberately this altered state was tied to battlefield function. The trance was not permanent. It was entered when needed. That distinction matters because it separates myth from discipline. A man who cannot leave fury is useless. A man who can step into it and step back becomes something else entirely. Sources hint that Úlfhéðnar did not rush blindly into combat. They were released at specific moments, when formations needed to be broken, when morale needed to collapse. Their timing was as important as their ferocity. Contemporary observers describe something unnerving. These men did not shout war cries like others. They advanced silently, or with low animal sounds. They did not taunt. They did not posture. They moved forward with a certainty that suggested they had already accepted the outcome. That acceptance was the core of the trance. Pain did not vanish. Wounds still bled. But the mind no longer prioritized avoidance. Modern neuroscience would describe this as altered pain processing under extreme stress. The Norse described it differently. The man had stepped into the wolf. This had consequences. A warrior in this state did not distinguish easily between enemy and obstacle. Friendly fire was not myth. It was risk. That is why sagas suggest Úlfhéðnar were often positioned at the front, away from allied flanks, and sometimes kept apart until the moment of release. Control did not end when the fighting stopped. The trance had to be exited. This was the most dangerous moment. Some accounts describe collapse, men shaking, exhausted, barely conscious. Others hint at lingering aggression, a delayed return to ordinary restraint. This is where myth and lived reality likely overlap. Anyone who has experienced extreme combat stress knows the come down can be as destabilizing as the fight itself. Kings needed warriors who could fight. They also needed men who could return to camp without killing someone. This tension explains why the Úlfhéðnar were never numerous. Training men to suppress fear is easier than training them to re-enter society afterward. Too many wolf warriors would destabilize the very communities they defended. Law codes from later periods reflect this anxiety. Men who attacked others in trance-like fury were sometimes punished harshly, not because their violence was new, but because it was no longer acceptable. What had once been sacred was becoming criminal. Religion accelerated the shift, but it did not create it. Even in pagan times, the wolf was feared as much as revered. Odin himself was not a comforting god. He was the patron of the hanged, the executed, the outcast. To serve him fully was to accept marginalization. Úlfhéðnar were not household heroes. They were weapons stored carefully and brought out when needed. And weapons wear out. As Scandinavia moved towards centralized kingship, written law, and Christian moral frameworks, the space for men who lived partly outside humanity narrowed. The wolf warrior no longer fit the future. But before they faded into legend, they left a mark, not just on battlefields, on the Norse understanding of what a warrior could become, and what the cost of becoming that thing truly was. And that brings us to the moment when the Úlfhéðnar mattered most, not in myth, not in poetry, but in one decisive battle where their presence changed the fate of a kingdom. The Battle of Hafrsfjord did not begin as a legend, it began as a problem. By the late 9th century, Norway was not a kingdom. It was a patchwork of rival chieftains, alliances formed and broken by marriage, oath, and violence. Power was local, loyalty was conditional. And Harald Fairhair's ambition to rule all of Norway was seen by many as an existential threat. To unify the land, Harald needed more than numbers. He needed shock. Hafrsfjord, a narrow inlet on Norway's western coast, was the place where resistance finally gathered. Local rulers brought fleets and warriors to stop Harald's expansion once and for all. Ships crowded the water, shields lined the rails. This was not a raid. It was a decisive confrontation. The sagas describe Harald's force as disciplined, but what stands out is who he placed at the front. The Úlfhéðnar, not mixed into the line, not held in reserve, released. The poetry of the Haraldskvæði is careful with words. It does not say the wolf-coated men fought bravely. It says iron did not bite them. This is not literal immortality. It is a description of behavior. These were men who advanced into spear points without breaking, who continued forward when others would recoil, who refused to yield ground even as casualties mounted. In naval combat, this mattered enormously. Ship-to-ship fighting was close, chaotic, and unforgiving. Once grappling hooks locked vessels together, there was no retreat. Morale decided everything. A single breach could cascade into collapse across a formation. The Úlfhéðnar were sent into those breaches. Their role was not to hold a shield wall. It was to destroy the enemy's confidence. When wolf warriors boarded a ship, they did not fight to push men back. They fought to remove resistance entirely. Panic spread faster than orders. Crews abandoned positions, lines dissolved. And once fear took hold on water, there was nowhere to run. This is why the battle turned, not because Harald had more ships, not because his claim was stronger, because his enemies faced something they did not understand. The sagas do not dwell on individual heroics here. That omission is telling. This was not about named champions. It was about effect, about the sudden realization, spreading from ship to ship, that the fight had entered a phase where ordinary courage was no longer enough. By the end of the battle, Harald stood victorious. Norway, for the first time, had a single king, and the Úlfhéðnar had done exactly what they were created to do. But victory carries consequences. Once a kingdom exists, it must be governed. Once borders are established, violence must be regulated. Shock troops are invaluable in conquest, but dangerous in consolidation. Harold understood this. Sources suggest that after Hafrsfjord, the prominence of the Úlfhéðnar fades. They do not vanish instantly, but they are no longer central. The work of kingship required law, taxation, and predictable force. Warriors who thrived on trance and transformation did not fit neatly into that structure. The wolf had helped build the crown. Now the crown needed to chain the wolf. This is a pattern repeated across history. Warrior cults rise in times of fragmentation and fall in times of order. The very traits that make them decisive become liabilities once stability is achieved. For the Úlfhéðnar, this meant disappearance into story. They became figures of poetry rather than policy. Symbols of an older, harsher age. Their legacy survived not through institutions, but through unease, through tales that warned as much as they praised. Because everyone remembered what happened when the wolf was unleashed, and everyone understood why it could not be done too often. Yet even as they faded from battlefields, the idea of the wolf warrior refused to die. It lingered. In outlaw legends, in heroes who stood alone, in stories where civilization felt thin and fragile. And that lingering presence raises one final question. If the Úlfhéðnar were so effective, so feared, and so closely tied to Odin himself, why were they never revived? The answer lies not in warfare, but in memory. By the time Christian scribes began writing down the sagas, the Úlfhéðnar already belonged to the past. That distance matters. None of our sources were written by men who had stood beside wolf warriors in battle. They were written generations later, by authors living in a world that no longer tolerated trance fighters or warrior cults. A world of law codes, bishops, kings, and courts. And yet, despite every reason to erase or soften them, the Úlfhéðnar remain. Not cleanly, not comfortably. They survive as something unresolved. The poems are the oldest layer. Skaldic verse like the Haraldskvedi is close to the events it describes, composed to be recited in royal halls, where exaggeration was dangerous. Praise poetry that lied too obviously lost its power. When such verse speaks of wolf-coated men, whom iron could not bite, it is not writing fantasy. It is encoding reputation. Later sagas expand the image. Gretti's saga and Vatnsdæla saga do not present wolf-like warriors as admirable in a modern sense. They are unsettling, quarrelsome, prone to violence, often isolated, often doomed. These are not heroes meant to be imitated. They are warnings. This is where historians hesitate, because the sagas blur categories. Some Úlfhéðnar may have been elite troops. Some may have been outlaw warriors mythologized after death. Some may never have existed at all, created to explain fear on the battlefield. But the consistency across sources matters. The wolf motif does not drift randomly. It remains tied to Odin, to battle trance, to men who step outside normal society. That suggests a cultural pattern, not a single invention. Archaeology does not give us wolf warriors neatly preserved. It rarely does. Trance leaves no bones. But it gives context, ritual animal symbolism, warrior burials emphasizing identity over wealth, and a broader Indo-European tradition of young men entering liminal states through violence and isolation. The Úlfhéðnar fit this pattern perfectly. What unsettles modern readers is not whether every detail is true, it's that enough of it is plausible. Controlled trance, shock warfare, psychological dominance, men trained to suppress fear beyond ordinary limits. These are not fantasy concepts. They appear again and again in human conflict, under different names, in different cultures. The Norse simply wrapped them in wolf skins and gave them to Odin. And that brings us to the real reason the Úlfhéðnar were never revived. Not because they were ineffective, but because they worked too well. A society that legitimizes warriors who abandon normal restraint must also accept what happens when restraint disappears elsewhere. You cannot ask men to become predators in war and expect them to become farmers in peace. The wolf does not negotiate with fences. Christian kings understood this instinctively. So did pagan ones eventually. The memory of the Úlfhéðnar became safer than their presence. Stories could be told, songs could be sung, but the living role was allowed to die. Yet the fascination remains, because somewhere deep in human history is the idea that civilization is thinner than we admit. That order depends on men who can cross a line, and on societies wise enough to know when to pull them back. The Norse did not romanticize this tension. They feared it. That fear is why the wolf warrior endures in memory rather than institution. And why, even now, the idea of the Úlfhéðnar feels dangerous, not because it is false, but because it points to something uncomfortably real about what humans are capable of becoming. Which leaves one final piece of the story. Not how the Úlfhéðnar fought, not how they vanished, but what they left behind. The Úlfhéðnar did not survive as an order. They survived as an idea. Long after their hides rotted and their names dissolved into poetry, the image remained. The warrior who steps beyond ordinary fear, who abandons the safety of civilization to become something sharper, colder, and more dangerous. Not for chaos, but for purpose. That idea never truly disappears. It retreats. It waits. In later Scandinavian folklore, echoes of the wolf warrior appear as outlaws living beyond the law's reach. Men who cannot be contained by farms, oaths, or kings. They are often tragic figures, powerful, isolated, doomed. Their strength is inseparable from their exile. This is not accidental storytelling. It is cultural memory processing its own limits. The Norse understood that certain kinds of warriors are necessary only briefly. They exist to break deadlocks, shatter resistance, and force transitions. Once the transition is complete, they must fade or be destroyed. That understanding separates myth from propaganda. The Úlfhéðnar were never held up as a permanent ideal. They were treated as a phase, a weapon drawn in desperation, something to be respected, feared, and ultimately put away. Modern culture often gets this wrong. We romanticize the wolf. We aestheticize the fury. We forget the cost. But the old sources do not. They emphasize aftermath, isolation, difficulty returning, violence leaking into places it no longer belongs. The sagas do not end with wolf warriors celebrated at feasts. They end with them wandering, outlawed, or dead. And yet, the fascination persists. Why? Because the Úlfhéðnar sit at the fault line between two truths humans struggle to reconcile. That civilization depends on restraint, and that survival sometimes requires abandoning it. The Norse did not resolve this contradiction. They lived inside it. They gave the wolf to Odin, the god of sacrifice, not comfort. They acknowledged that some power cannot belong to ordinary life, that it must be bounded by ritual, myth, and fear. This is why the wolf warrior was never fully normalized. To normalize it would be to invite collapse. Every society that survives long enough learns this lesson in its own way. Rome institutionalized terror, then strangled it with law. Medieval kingdoms relied on knightly violence, then wrapped it in chivalry. Modern states build professional armies, then struggle endlessly with what those soldiers carry home. The Norse simply told stories, stories that warned as much as they inspired. So when we speak of the Úlfhéðnar today, we are not talking about costumes or legends. We are talking about a boundary. The line between man and weapon, between control and necessity, between what society needs and what it cannot afford to keep. The wolf stands at that line, watching, waiting, not asking to be unleashed again, only reminding us that once it is, it never comes back unchanged. That is the legacy of the Úlfhéðnar, not glory, not conquest, but the knowledge that some victories demand a price too high to pay twice.